We are back and we are processing an onslaught of recriminations and lamentation about the prosecution of Donald Trump for his assortment of crimes against democracy, and what a mistake it was, apparently, for the Justice Department to bring charges against him, for all these other prosecutors to hold him accountable or try to hold him accountable for the various crimes he committed across the landscape, from the misuse and the maintenance of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago to his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Outlets from the New York Times to the New Yorker are decrying what they perceive as the backfiring of these efforts to hold Trump to account. And we were a little bit hair on fire here, joined by sort of political luminary, the former political director of the AFL-CIO, Michael Podhorzer, here with Lisa Graves. Mike has amazing insight and perspective into what this media take is getting wrong. Mike, how have you been processing what has been, I think, the dominant narrative in this post-election period?
Sure. I think that unfortunately, and I think this reflects a greater problem in sort of the way the establishment has looked at holding what I call people who are too big to jail accountable. That really goes all the way back, at least back to the fact that no one was prosecuted after the banks crashed the economy and forced, untold misery into homeowners and loss of jobs and all of that, and there was no accountability. I think that the sort of elite kind of media voices that you're talking about have basically accepted this idea, and it's a real problem. It's a problem because it basically creates permission for breaking the laws that protect not just democracy, but our rights. Right? That it was clear that it was so clear that Donald Trump incited an insurrection to prevent the voices of the 81 million people who voted against him, right, to throw that out. It was a crime against them. It was a crime against the rule of law in the country. It was such a crime that on the very day that the Senate acquitted him in the second impeachment trial, Mitch McConnell, of all people, said that it was now time for the criminal justice system to hold him accountable. And unfortunately, two things made that impossible. The first was that, notwithstanding its claims that it was running to save the soul of America, it was not until 2023 that the Justice Department finally appointed a special counsel for this. It should have been done the week after the second impeachment trial failed. But the other thing that that all of the takes you're talking about from the media completely leave out is that by what we all thought the law was in February of 2024, first, Trump should not be able to be president because he violated the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment. But a Supreme Court majority that consisted of half people he appointed said, oh, that insurrection clause, it doesn't really cover this anymore. And then went on more famously, the immunity ruling. And that ruling wasn't enough. It was that they delayed having any kind of trial past the point it could happen before the election. And I think it's really important for people watching this to understand that whether it was the January 6th case, Mar-a-Lago, New York, any of what Trump has been charged with, every time it's been brought to a grand jury, he's been indicted. Anytime it's been brought before a trial jury, he's been convicted. Anytime it's been brought before judges that were appointed by anybody but him, including by George W. Bush, he's lost those cases. But every time it's come before the justices of the Supreme Court that he appointed, or Judge Cannon in Florida, he has won in ways that are completely unprecedented in American history, right? So it isn't that he had a brilliant legal strategy. It's that that the Roberts majority let him off the hook. And so that is what is being whitewashed by all of these media commentaries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of those commentaries are not even worth a dime a dozen. And it's just another part of this obeying in advance phenomenon that we've been seeing, which is, it's really unfortunate to see. Obviously, some of these are just a particular person at the outlet versus the outlet itself. Although in the case of the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, it was the outlets that really caved into Trump and violated their own standards, their own history, their own practices, in the investigative work that their reporters have done. And so I do think I really appreciate your point, Mike, about the fact that it's been Trump judges or the Roberts Court, which is, that majority is half Trump judges and then half MAGA justices, really, in the form of John Roberts himself, who really put his thumb on the scale in this election. Alex and I were talking about how there's all this hand-wringing over the pardon for Hunter Biden after Kash Patel was named as the person to lead the FBI despite his manifest unfitness for that role, and how that in essence provoked Biden to pardon his son, who would be targeted by Kash Patel. But the fact is that that's not the pardon we should be talking about. The pardon we should be talking about is the pardon of Donald Trump by John Roberts and by Sam Alito and by the Justice Thomas and by the justices that Trump was able to put on the court, two seats of which were stolen. And so the real pardon that happened, and it's like, I think you wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, Mike, we don't really have a historical reference point for the type of judicial coup that just took place over the course of these three decisions. If you look at these three decisions, the decision that you mentioned in the Colorado case, the Trump versus United States case involving the unprecedented assertion of criminal immunity for a president, and then also the Fisher case, where the court dismissed a whole set of charges against people who were actively invading the Capitol. What you have is the Roberts Court and these MAGA justices signaling to the American people that Trump did nothing wrong, that he did nothing that would bar him from office, despite the plain language of the 14th Amendment, that some of his followers did nothing wrong, and that he himself could do no wrong. And I can't help but think how many potentially millions of Americans took solace in these lawless decisions, in my view, by this Supreme Court, by John Roberts and his cohorts, in basically pardoning Trump and allowing him to take office and helping him take office by basically rationalizing and providing him fuel for his claims that he didn't do anything wrong when he manifestly did. And which I think is one of the reasons why, another thing Alex and I have talked quite a bit about is how, what does the rule of law mean when they're issuing rulings on law that are completely incoherent with the actual law that we've known. And so, Alex and I have been talking about that too, and really glad to have you on.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad to be here. And I think that's a nice turn of phrase in terms of them pardoning Trump. I think that, although I think in a way it almost does that understates it, because to extend the metaphor, the Biden didn't say that the rule from now on is that sons of presidents can do tax fraud, right? Right. It wasn't saying,
yeah.
Right. I mean, there are ways to debate whether and how that quote pardon happened, but this was much worse than a pardon, right?
Yeah, and at least, back on Hunter's pardon, at least Biden let the criminal process play out before he, frankly, it wasn't, maybe it's been criticized as sort of a breaking of another norm, but, and in some ways it is, and there's reasons to criticize the Hunter pardon, but, that is very clearly within the scope of a president's power. In this case, it's like a pre-pardon, right? They didn't even let him stand trial. They so completely broke the rules of the game to make sure he never faced accountability. And all along, I think all these establishment voices, from the media to the Democrats themselves, certainly the legal profession, just kept finding ways to reconcile, even as they criticized these outcomes, to reconcile what the court was doing within some kind of institutional framework. And that goes back to this last several decades of institutional wreckage by this Roberts Court, where we have truly been frogs boiling. And in each case, as they did more and more damage to our ability to see the will of the people reflect their values, their priorities in the government, in the laws of our country. And we have just kept hoping with this kind of naive, blind faith that our institutions would protect us. And I think you can see it right there in the Garland prosecution of Trump, the delay, the tiptoeing around the clear need for prosecution in those cases, the failure to prosecute so many of the accomplices to these crimes, whereby in the concern about the perception of politics infecting the law enforcement process, they let politics affect the law enforcement process.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think, go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I was saying, and that's actually one of the things that just continues to astonish me is you have someone now who's the president-elect who literally has talked about using the Justice Department to go against his enemies, using the FBI to go against his enemies. This is not new. This dates back to 2016 and lock her up and everything else. And then for baseless, saying they're going to go after journalists or people who criticize the court, utterly baseless, things that are not crimes. Investigating January 6th, not a crime. So you have this happening in one universe, the universe we live in. And then you have this idea that somehow if Merrick Garland had actually acted quickly in it, pursuing the actual laws that were actually violated, that, as you point out, the grand jury found there was substantial evidence of violation, that's politicizing it. No, that's actually following the law. That's actually doing what criminal justice demands in a nation where no person is above the law. And, one of the things, as I've been looking, closely at John Roberts, is one of the big headlines coming out of his confirmation hearings to the U.S. Supreme Court was a headline, "No one is above the law." That was because he was being confirmed in the immediate aftermath of revelations of torture that were going on, during the Bush administration. And he made a promise. Of course, in America, no one is above the law. And then at the moment when that pledge mattered the most, he not just broke it, he aggressively took on himself, usurped, in essence, the power to pardon by pardoning Trump, not just retrospectively, but in the future that we're about to face.
Yeah. And while there's so much to respond there, I think that, one of the things Alex said a minute ago is about, the frogs in boiling water. And I think the problem with the commentary that says, that it was the prosecution of Trump that politicized it, or that it backfired, all of those things, right? They, in fact, are the chorus that as we frogs have been in this increasingly hot water for the last couple of decades, have been scolding us for not appreciating the fact that we all get free saunas, right? That there's really nothing wrong here. And I think that it is actually makes it worse than what I think is another problem, which is obeying in advance. I think it's much worse than that, because what it's doing is saying it is allowing our sense of what history will say about this period to be rewritten, right? Yeah. And there's a really deep echo to the turn of the 20th century, when the commitments after the Civil War to Reconstruction were abandoned. And that required not just pulling back, but retelling the history of what Reconstruction was about in a way that for a half century made the failure of Reconstruction the fault of freed African Americans and those trying to protect their rights, right? And we are in the same kind of danger right now and we're going to see this in the next anniversary of January 6th and the likely pardon when Trump gets in of everybody who was convicted, right? Where we are going to actually have as contested history what just happened. And these establishment voices are part and parcel of the revisionists who, after Reconstruction, were telling us that the problem wasn't KKK terrorism, it wasn't the Jim Crow constitutions, it was the corruption of Republican politicians and liberated African Americans. And it is that serious and that important.
Yeah, it really reminds me of that saying that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And here we're seeing the history that we all saw with our own eyes of Trump's incitement, history that the January 6th committee documented, what we all saw on January 6th in terms of this violent and grotesque desecration of our Capitol to try to stop those 81 million votes from counting, and having that turned into like that was the wrong side somehow, that seeing the truth that was the wrong side. So I'm just so grateful, Mike, to be on this channel with you and with Alex.
Yeah,
and glad to have the chance to have these conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're really important. I think what you're getting at, Mike, the need to have this context understood broadly to push back on these really misguided narratives. It's not just like to have sort of like wonky and interesting conversations among ourselves. It's to set a path forward for the future. Maybe you could talk a little bit, particularly from your background in labor organizing, in movement organizing, why this is so important, where it heads, right, as we enter this dark period, and what this type of conversation, what this type of contextualization can give us in terms of tools to fight back and give ourselves a better future.
Sure. I think the most important tool here is to, outside of the partisan political context, to have a clear sense of what is legitimate as opposed to what is legal. And that has always been necessary for the progress of human rights or equality in this country. And this is something that Martin Luther King, among others, Frederick Douglass, everybody has had to say, that at dark periods in our time, there's been legal segregation. Women weren't allowed to vote. And there have to be people who see that and understand that as being legal in the moment, but not at all legitimate. And we are in that kind of period, right, where we have a hijacking of the Supreme Court by a set of 6 justices who were put there to do through fiat what no democratic process would ever happen in this country, right? I mean, for people who can remember all the way back to 2009, 2010, the biggest problem that people felt in the country was not that billionaires were not able to give enough money to politics, that our democracy suffered for not hearing more from the richest among us, right? And yet that was essential to the billionaires who put John Roberts and Sam Alito and the others on the court. And it's kind of like they basically, got hired to guard the hen house, and their first act was to unlock it, right?
Yeah.
And then sort of say, well, we don't understand what's happening to all the chickens, right? That's just like legit. And at that point, right, that people were not clamoring for politicians to be able to gerrymander districts they'd never lose in, right? They didn't think the problem was that there was too much electoral competition, right?
Yeah.
But they do it outside of it. They didn't think we need to pass a bill to overturn Roe, right? They didn't think we need, the biggest problem in this country is that not enough people can get AR-15s, right?
Yep.
I mean, and that's what they've been doing. And they've done all of that without the vote on the court of anybody other than the 5, now 6 of them that were appointed to do it.
Yep.
Right. And the problem with all the, commentary and sort of whitewashing of this by the so-called liberal media is that, and this brings it back to actually your question, is that as long as we're all saying this is in some sense legitimate, there isn't an organizing principle to resist it, right?
Yeah.
Other than, hey, maybe we'll win the next election with better messaging.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the solutions, when we have overcome this at our finest moments in our history, it's because of the coming together of really powerful collective action outside the electoral process. And that's what we have to dedicate ourselves to this over this next period. And central to that has been recognizing that having more people in unions is indispensable to all of that happening, right? That there hasn't been an example either in the United States or overseas where autocracy, where plutocracy has been resisted when there isn't a strong labor movement. And people have to understand that even if they are in an occupation that isn't about to be unionized, that you can't have democracy without unions. And that's where we have to turn.
Yep.
Amazing. We've got frogs, we've got chickens, we've got the power of action. We have got a really wonderful, engaged, and growing community here at Midas Touch Legal AF and Court Accountability Action. Hit that like and subscribe button. Make sure to share this stuff with your network. Keep it growing. We are so grateful to have you join us here, Mike.
Thank you.
Anytime, Lisa. It's great to see you as always. And until next time, signing off.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.